All right, so this is going to be sort of a transition from Chapter 8 to Chapter 9, still in 8, but Chapter 8 is an introduction to Chapter 9, emphasizing the energetics. Chapter 9 goes through energetics, goes through what it's like when any eukaryotic cell, plant cell, animal cell, fungus cell, so any human cell, every cell in our body does something called cellular respiration, and it's a good term because cells respire in the presence of oxygen that we're breathing in. That's why we breathe in oxygen. The cell can burn glucose down through a multi-step process and burn the glucose down to release carbon dioxide. And we have a highly exergonic reaction, releasing a bunch of energy, the same amount of energy that's released when wood cellulose is burned in a fire. Okay, so here's that reaction. So this is a chemical reaction that happens in a fire. And these are the reactants, and these are the products. Primarily what's burning in the wood is cellulose. Cellulose is a polymer of glucose. So really what we've got is glucose plus oxygen burning down to carbon dioxide and water vapor. Those are some of the fumes that are released. Here's just an image of glucose, and that cellulose is a polymer of glucose. We can't digest that, it's fiber, in our diet because we can't break that type of bond. We don't have an enzyme, and almost no organisms do. Termites, for example, can break down cellulose because they have a bacteria that has this enzyme, and that bacteria can start the reaction of breaking down cellulose and then releasing glucose, which any cell could use for energy. And so the cellulose is something we don't usually think of as a dietary source, but it's got glucose in it. And here is the formula for glucose, and it's a balanced reaction showing how in chemistry the reaction or substrates in biology would go to products. And it's the same reaction if it's in fire or if it's sugar in a candy bar in our bodies. Same for burning sugar in your body. How much heat is released, how much energy is released during this. So it's a highly exergonic reaction. Notice that you can use either kilocalories per mole or kilojoules per mole. Calories is a measure of heat, actually, as a way of measuring energy release, and joules is a measure of work. So it's a kind of a nice way of saying we could get this energy released either as heat, work, or a combination of the two. We're going to learn in Chapter 9 that the big goal in our body of burning glucose and releasing CO2, in Chapter 9 we'll learn that the goal of cellular respiration is to use this exergonic reaction to synthesize ATP, an endergonic reaction of taking ADP and phosphate and adding that to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And in general, in cellular respiration in our body, we can get about 36, it depends on the condition, about 36 ATP. And we already talked that you might as well go ahead and learn that 1 ATP takes about a plus delta G of 7.3 kilocalories per mole to produce. So let's just find a little calculator and see if we can make this calculation of taking 36 ATP times 7.3 to get a total of 262.8. And so we got 262.8 kilocalories per mole that we captured, and what we saw was that the amount of energy released was, I think, 686 kilocalories per mole. So about 38% of the energy is captured. So let's just look back at this again. And so about 686 kilocalories are captured, and are released, and about 38% of that energy is captured, and that's called the efficiency. When a car engine is running, there is a loss of a lot of heat, and a car engine converts a exergonic reaction into work. That's what engines do, and it has a certain efficiency, and the efficiency of any engine is much lower than 38%. We have a very efficient, and it is an engine. An engine captures energy released in chemical reactions, and we'll see in Chapter 9 that we're going to have a very efficient energy engine. And that's one of the key things about how evolution has sculpted what is a kind of a complicated multi-step chemical reaction we'll see, series of chemical reactions we'll see in Chapter 9, to capture as much energy as possible. The next thing I want to point out is that chemical reactions in biology are often what are called redox reactions. And in a redox reaction, one reactant gets reduced, which means that it gains electrons in the process, and the other is oxidizes, it loses electrons. So we want to use that terminology because our book uses it a lot, and let's just go back to see this. In this reaction, this glucose, the carbons in this glucose get oxidized to CO2, and the oxygen gets reduced. So O2 gets reduced, and especially the carbon we focus on gets oxidized. Oh, the O2 gets, the oxygen gets oxidized, gets reduced here and here. So in both these cases, the oxygen is going to get reduced. And so let's just talk through that chemistry. When sodium chloride is dissolved into water, the chlorine gets reduced. It physically gains an electron. The sodium gets oxidized. It loses an electron. So we have a redox reaction. One thing is oxidized, one thing is reduced. The tricky thing about the redox chemistry in biology is often that that they don't actually gain and lose a whole electron, but you'll see have a relative increase or decrease in their electrons based on the electronegativity. So burning glucose is a redox reaction, and there it is, and that is true either in a fire or in our body. It's the same chemical reaction. It's a redox reaction. How is it that that the carbon gets oxidized? And the way it gets oxidized is that carbon has a comparable electronegativity with hydrogen. So in glucose, there are lots of nonpolar bonds, and the electrons are shared equally. When we say it gets oxidized, it loses electrons simply because in carbon dioxide, let me just cross that out. In carbon dioxide, now the carbon is sharing electrons with oxygen, which is more electronegative than carbon, and so the oxygen is pulling the electrons away from the carbon. And so carbon hasn't fully lost electrons, but it has lost some of the share of electrons, and so it gets oxidized. That's why we put little quotes here and says it loses electrons. And you'll be able to see that in turn, oxygen, which is sharing electrons equally in molecular oxygen, starts to gain more electrons, either here or here in water, where oxygen is more electronegative than either carbon or hydrogen. In Chapter 9, Chapter 10, which again is not on the exam, not on midterm, we will learn that the exact opposite reaction occurs in photosynthesis. It's redox chemistry going in the opposite direction. Here, plants grab CO2 out of the air, out of the atmosphere, and use the energy of light to drive the endergonic reaction of synthesizing this highly reduced glucose and releasing oxygen into the atmosphere famously. Okay, so here it's just from her book showing the position of these electrons and the idea that the carbon is losing its share, losing some of its grip on the electrons in the process. We generally think of oxidized molecules as being lower potential energy. And the more reduced, the higher the potential energy. We've said before that fats and oils have higher potential energy than sugars. And remember that fats have a lot of nonpolar carbon-hydrogen bonds. And that is a higher energy bond than the mixture of bonds in a sugar. There are some carbon-hydrogen bonds in a sugar, but there are also some carbon-oxygen and lots of carbon-carbon bonds like that. So sugars are not as highly reduced as fats. And in general, biomolecules get reduced, they rise to higher energy levels. Conversely, as they get oxidized, they go to lower energy levels and energy is released. So we think of that and we talk about some of that language. So when we say we synthesize ATP from ADP and phosphate, that's a redox reaction, and it turns out that ATP is getting reduced in the process and going to a higher energy state. And this is just a summary of this overall reaction as we get ready to look at chapter 6. Chapter 10. And there are going to be lots of enzymes regulating each of the steps, and we've already introduced that. And so on we go to chapter 9.